Greetings all, I'm Aaron Mills, and welcome back to Look Up on the Screen, a retrospective of Superman in cinema. Last time, we looked at Superman and the Mole Men, the first Superman feature film. And for almost 30 years, it was the only Superman feature film. However, as we all know, that changed in 1978 when director Richard Donner helmed the first Superman movie for the blockbuster era. Superman the movie was released during the holiday season of 1978 and proved to be a massive hit for father and son producers Alexander and Ilya Salkind. Richard Donner's deft direction, John Williams' amazing score, spectacular camera work by DP Jeffrey Unsworth, and of course a star-making turn by Christopher Reeve as Superman, all came together to create a cinematic and above all, honest portrayal of Superman on screen, establishing itself as a multi-generational classic. However, while the movie may have seemed seamless and astounding, getting it to that point was anything but. While I could recap the film for you and look at it from the typical reviewer perspective, I'm not gonna do that. If you're watching this show, presumably you've seen the movie, probably multiple times, and you know how good it is. If you're really interested in an in-depth analysis of why Superman the movie is as good as it is, allow me to refer you to this. And while rehashing why the movie is good is fun and all, it's not as much fun as talking about what was going on behind the scenes. Because quite frankly, it's amazing that this movie even got made at all, and a minor miracle that it didn't wind up being one of the biggest cinematic disasters in history. So that's what we're going to do instead. Ilya Salkind is a third-generation film producer following in the footsteps of his father, Alexander, and his grandfather, Michael. The Salkind legacy extended as far back to some of the films of Greta Garbo. In the mid-1970s, Alexander and Ilya had hit it big with an adaptation of The Three Musketeers starring Oliver Reed, Richard Chamberlain, and Frank Finlay. However, the Salkinds had what they thought was a brilliant plan: make two movies at the same time. Too bad nobody told the cast that was what was going on. When it was discovered that the cast were making two movies but only getting paid for one, there were lawsuits aplenty, and the Screen Actors Guild implemented a policy which is known to this day as the Salkind Clause, which requires contracts to specify if an actor is being hired for one film or multiple productions. The Three Musketeers and its sequels were both hits, but unfortunately tragedy befell the Salkind family during production. Michael Salkind passed away, leaving Alexander and Ilya to carry on the family business. A dynamic soon emerged afterward. Ilya was the idea man, while Alexander was in charge of finding funding for the various productions. And so, one day, Ilya came and pitched the idea of making a Superman movie to his father, who didn't get it. But that didn't matter when Alexander went back to Europe looking for investors and found enthusiastic response. The next step was to convince Warner Brothers to hand over the film rights to the character. These days, where everything is a franchise and a potential moneymaker, this seems ludicrous, but in 1973, comics were pretty much derided as kid stuff, and Warners didn't really care, seeing Superman as being too difficult to adapt to film. There were, however, some speed bumps with DC Comics, who made a number of demands. Too many, in fact. Ilya wound up going over DC's heads to Warner Publishing, to which the comic company was subservient. They signed off on the deal, selling the rights to Superman for $4 million. DC was allowed to have a liaison involved to consult, though veto power would be limited. There was also a negative pickup deal, which meant Warner Brothers would have first crack at distribution, but it was up to the Salkinds to put up the money for the actual production. And so the search for a screenwriter was on. Ilya had very firm ideas about the tone of the movie, which he wanted to be fun, but without all the campiness that had plagued other superhero productions to this point. Various screenwriters were thought of, including Alfred Bester and William Goldman, but Bester was rejected because Alexander wanted a name screenwriter attached to the project, and while Goldman was one of the most famous screenwriters in Hollywood, he couldn't get up the requisite enthusiasm for the project and declined. Enter Mario Puzo. Puzo had gotten high-profile attention for his best-selling novel of mafia intrigue, The Godfather, the film adaptation of which earned countless awards and acclaim. After being pitched the basic concept, Puzo went off and wrote the first draft of the script, which was a nigh unfilmable 300-page behemoth that would require $500 million in 1970s dollars to make. Puzo was not amenable to paring down the script and left the project in 1975, although he would still receive story by and screenplay by credits for his efforts. The Salkinds hired writers Robert Benton and David Newman to try to work Puzo's gargantuan script into something filmable, which was a little difficult because it contained just about everything that you had to have in your first Superman movie. The destruction of Krypton, Clark's growing up in Smallville, moving to Metropolis, introducing Lois Lane and Lex Luthor, and even a quartet of Kryptonian criminals out for revenge on Superman for being imprisoned by Jor-El. Faced with all of this, the production team decided to do something that had worked for the Salkinds in the past. Turn one movie into two. Benton left the project to direct his own movie, The Late Show, and Newman brought in his wife Leslie to help revamp the script. Meanwhile, the search for a director was on. In 1975, the Salkinds received the call from an agent of a young film director named Steven Spielberg, who, according to the agent, was a huge Superman fan and wanted to be part of the project. Now keep in mind, Jaws hadn't been released yet, and while Ilya had seen an advanced screening and was convinced Spielberg would be perfect, Alexander didn't agree and wanted to see how The Giant Fish movie would do before committing. And since Alexander controlled the money, Ilya had no choice but to decline. Later, they would go back to Spielberg, and the slight was returned. Frequent James Bond director Guy Hamilton was eventually signed to direct. There was just one problem. There wasn't a deal in place for anyone to distribute the damn thing. No studio would touch it without a star attached. Over $1 million had already been sunk into development, and the Salkinds were starting to run out of money and out of time. And literally days before Ilya was ready to pull the plug on the whole project, he got a phone call with 5 words that would change everything. I can get you Brando. Yes, Marlon Brando. The name alone, especially after The Godfather, was enough to gain Hollywood's attention. Brando got an astonishing $3.7 million, plus a percentage of the gross, which totaled about $15 million when all was said and done. And this was despite Brando's infamous lack of work ethic during this point in his career. He claimed he liked to preserve spontaneity in his performances, so as such, he would refuse to memorize his lines, instead tacking them up all over the set on any surface that was off camera, including to co-star Sarah Douglas's head. She was playing Ursa, by the way. Not only that, in between takes, Brando would repeatedly fondle Douglas, who was too starstruck to file any sort of sexual harassment complaint. His other suggestions were even worse, going so far as to suggest that his role be voice only, and that Jor-El be played on screen by a bagel. Seriously.
These are matters of undeniable fact.
However, Brando's presence and high paychecks sent waves across Hollywood and resulted in one other major role being cast. Gene Hackman expressed interest in being in the film, wanting to work with Brando. However, by that point, the only role available for him was Lex Luthor, and because of the script, the two actually wouldn't have any scenes together. Apparently, just the ability to say he'd been in the same film as Brando was enough for Hackman, and he signed on. With this kind of star power, Warner snapped up the distribution rights. Production was set to begin in Rome. However, they ran into a problem when the Italian government declared Brando's movie The Last Tango in Paris obscene, and Brando risked arrest by even entering the country. Production was then moved to Pinewood Studios in England, where another snag hit. Director Guy Hamilton fell into a weird tax bracket where his entire salary would be taken by the UK government. And as a result, to avoid this kind of situation, Hamilton could only spend a maximum of 30 days within the UK in any given calendar year. Clearly, one of them was going to have to go. And just as clearly, it was Hamilton who left. That left the movie without a director. Enter Richard Donner. Originally starting as an actor, then moving into directing, Donner had recently scored a hit with The Omen and was a perfect candidate for Warner Brothers. Donner hit upon what he felt was the major problems with the production so far, stating, "You had European producers and an English director trying to tell an American fable, and I don't think they actually knew what the fable was." Donner brought in writer Tom Mankiewicz to help tighten up the scripts and excise some of the more campier moments that still remained. He even went so far as to put signs reading verisimilitude in every production office to get the point across that while the source material may have been unrealistic, the movie wouldn't work at all unless the audience felt it was real. However, Donner did get some warning signs of what he was in for. Richard Lester, who had directed The Three Musketeers, warned Donner not to work with the Salkinds as he himself had yet to be paid for his own directorial efforts. Likewise, Donner began clashing with producer Pierre Spengler, who Donner saw as completely incompetent and nothing more than the liaison for Alexander Salkind. Despite all these warnings, Donner took the helm, and as a result, by 1977 the movie had everything in place to start shooting. Except Superman.
Like most producers before them, the Salkinds were finding it hard to cast the Man of Steel. Nearly every leading man in Hollywood was considered and turned down for one reason or another. Alexander Salkind had to be talked out of casting heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali as Superman at one point. Singer Neil Diamond was also considered, but he dropped out when he realized he would lose more money by not touring while production was going on than what his salary would actually be.
The casting of Brando and Hackman helped alleviate some, but not all, of the pressure in finding the perfect Superman. Or the perfect Lois Lane, for that matter. As far as Lois went, the actress who was cast as her was going to have to do a balancing act between making Lois a strong, capable woman and someone who is also likable and able to fall for Superman. Now, Stockard Channing was originally considered for the role, but after looking at her screen test, it was decided that her Lois Lane would probably eat Clark Kent alive. So the role eventually went to Margot Kidder, who was able to walk that tightrope beautifully. As far as Superman went, eventually, Donner and Mankiewicz decided to audition Christopher Reeve, a Juilliard-trained stage actor. However, when Reeve balked at flying out to California for a screen test because he was currently in a play in New York and he had no understudy, Donner went ahead and bought out every seat in the house for an entire weekend in order to have him come out and audition. And the second he appeared in costume and rumbled his first line, Donner knew they had found the Superman they were looking for.
With Superman in place and plans to shoot 2 movies simultaneously, production finally got underway in March of 1977, but it was already in financial trouble. Pre-production costs had already surpassed $7 million, largely because of Brando and Hackman's salaries. However, Guy Hamilton had been paid $750,000 in severance when Donner replaced him as director, and Warner Brothers had already taken an additional $1 million in advance for the film rights to Superman. This was a problem for the Salkinds, who had assured their investors that they could make the movie for $20 million. Now a third of that money was already gone before a single frame had been shot. This would cause massive contention between the Salkinds and Donner during production.
In his quest for verisimilitude, Donner was an exacting director who knew exactly what he wanted, and better still, how to get his crew to give it to him. Under his leadership, warring departments like matte painting, miniatures, and special effects were able to come together harmoniously to give Superman the visual splendor that it needed. As a result, Donner would actually take his time on shooting, which meant he wouldn't be satisfied until he got exactly what he wanted. This put him in conflict with the Salkinds, who were kind of panicked at this point. They had told their investors they could make the movie for $20 million, and now that they were faced with 2 movies costing $50 million, their priorities weren't so much as getting the movie right, as getting the movie done. In fact, the entire relationship between Alexander Salkind and Richard Donner could be summed up like this.
What is the basic problem with this picture? The basic problem with this picture, Alex, is that you're an asshole. The Salkinds were in a bind, hopelessly overextended with their creditors and unable to remove Donner since Warner Brothers were thrilled with the rushes they saw and were funneling money into the movie to finish it, contingent on Donner staying in the director's chair. Ilya then decided that if he couldn't fire Donner, maybe he could force him to quit. So he brought on Richard Lester as a second director, the idea being to make Donner so furious that he would leave. Of course, the Salkinds had to finally fork over the money they owed Lester for years, and as it turned out, the plan backfired. Donner and Lester got on so well that Donner handed second unit direction duties over to Lester, confident in his abilities.
The Salkinds' worries over money continued to plague the production. Weather conditions had delayed shooting of the Smallville scenes in Canada, and the 1977 New York blackout had caused problems for shooting the exterior scenes in Metropolis. It got so bad at one point that the Salkinds even held off paying the cast and crew, hoping that by holding the salaries in the bank longer, they'd accrue more interest. This did not go over well, nor did the fact that they unceremoniously fired the crew when production moved to Pinewood Studios in England, electing instead to use Pinewood's own in-house technicians.
Warner Brothers had found faith in the project, but constant reports of strife on the set caused them to bring Donner in to explain what the hell was going on. On the Salkinds' end, they were getting more and more worried about their own profit potential in the movie. With each influx of cash Warner's provided, they took another percentage of the film. Rumors abounded that Warner's was looking to oust the Salkinds altogether and take full ownership of the movie and the potential rewards. Donner explained how he was trying to get the movie right, while the Salkinds just wanted to get the movie done. Warner's decided to send a representative of their own to look after the studio's interests and smooth things over.
Another problem was the impending release date. Warner Brothers wanted to release the film in the summer of 1978, but even with over 1 million feet of film shot, the movie barely was taking any form of coherence at that point. So the release date was moved back to the holiday season of 1978, and Richard Lester made the welcome suggestion that the crew stop juggling their time between trying to get the first and the second movie done and focus strictly on completing the first film. As a result of this, location shooting began in New Mexico for the earthquake sequence, where it was promptly delayed by snow.
The Salkins were furious. They were now overextended to the point that when a production office was held up at gunpoint, the robber left empty-handed. There was nothing of any value to steal. Other issues continued to plague the production. Basics like safety mats on the floor of the studio where the flying sequences were being shot went by the wayside. In a tragic accident, a crew member was killed when he was crushed under the wing of an Air Force One replica that snapped off.
Ultimately, Richard Donner put together a 3-hour rough cut for screening for Warner executives and composer John Williams, who wanted to see more of the finished product before he'd agree to score the film. And fortunately for everyone concerned, everybody liked what they saw. The final effects shots were made, and once Christopher Reeve left the set after his final shot, Richard Donner had 10 weeks to deliver a finished print.
During that time, a massive undertaking was made to get Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster the recognition they deserved. Jerry Siegel had sent out a blistering press release lambasting the movie. Comic artist Neal Adams began a campaign to get Siegel and Shuster's names recognized as Superman's creators. After a fortuitous circumstance which allowed them to hold a press conference at the headquarters of the Overseas Press Club, triggering a slew of questions about why the creators of an American icon were being treated so shabbily, Warner Brothers finally sat down with Adams, Siegel, and Shuster and hammered out a deal. Siegel and Shuster would get credit for the creation of Superman on every production, being print, film, or whatever going forward, as well as a guaranteed annual $20,000 salary for the rest of their lives. Adams also managed to get them a $10,000 bonus on top of everything else.
Superman the movie was scheduled to premiere on December 10th, 1978 in Washington, D.C. There were going to be no preview screenings for critics, so this movie was going to sink or swim on its own standard release. In November, Warner Brothers called Alexander Salkind to inquire about the status of the finished print. Alexander said it was all ready to go. All Warner's had to do was pay him $15 million for it.
The Salkins' money woes had caused Alex to force Warner's to buy 3 international territories from him in order to pay off the creditors. Warner's was forced to remit, although it would turn out to have been a blessing in disguise. At the premiere, however, Ilya got a surprise of his own when a person he thought was a reporter slapped a manila folder in his hands and told him, "You've been served." Mario Puzo was suing the Salkins for not paying up the percentage of the profits he was entitled to only after the initial production costs were paid, which had naturally been piling up. A torrent of lawsuits soon followed, from Brando, then Kidder, and then from Reeve himself, citing that since shooting on Superman 2 had been interrupted, the 2 movies no longer counted as one production, and he wanted more money for work on the sequel. The Salkins had no choice but to agree to Reeve's demands. Meanwhile, Donner, in addition to filing his own lawsuit, was lashing out with invective in the press against the Salkinds and Pierre Spengler and demanding total creative control over the sequel.
Superman the movie was an unqualified smash at the box office, staying at number 1 for 11 weeks straight. It made $7 million in its opening weekend, $134 million domestically, over $300 million worldwide against a $55 million budget. Even those 3 territories that Warner's was forced to buy from Alexander Salkind proved to bite Salkind in the ass because they made more money than the $15 million that Warner's had paid, so they were perfectly happy with the result. Everything seemed to be on track to get back to work on the sequel. Until the day Richard Donner got a telegram informing him that his services would no longer be required. But we're going to talk about all that next time as we look at the 2 distinctly different cuts of Superman 2. I'm Aaron Mills, reminding you to look up on the screen.